Hello and welcome. I have been thinking for a while about making dollhouse people and all the bits and pieces that they need to live their happy dollhouse lives. And I decided to just get started with a person. And this dollhouse person is a fox. And I didn't have a pattern for this, but I have been drawing simple patterns for a long time. So I just drew up a simple shape, hoping that the fabric choices will indicate that it is indeed a fox. And I'm drawing some of the pieces as I go and just cutting them as I go as well, and just doing a simple fox shape. The way that I learned to make dolls is for tiny things you don't, like you draw on the line, you don't cut out too many pieces before you start. But with this one, I needed to spend a bit of time cutting out as well as putting together, just because I wanted him to have a bit of a pointy face. I didn't want his face to be very flat. But you can see with these ears and these arms that I am drawing, that I'm drawing the shape on the fabric. And while I will cut away from the main body of the fabric, I'm not cutting out the shapes until after I've sewn them. I find that this stops the fabric from getting stuck in your feed dogs and all that sort of thing, and it makes for an easier stitch, I think. And these are quite small. I am trying to make this little fox be sort of an adult-sized 1/12 scale dollhouse doll. So we'll see how it goes. Everything's allowed to be a bit hand wavy. I'm not worrying about it too much, but that's just what I'm aiming for. I have made lots of dolls in my life, but really not any for quite a while. And so when I got to turning through all these tiny pieces, I realized I didn't have all of my regular kit with me. So with these ears, they're not too narrow, so I am just turning through and wiggling the tips out, which works quite well. But when it came to these arms, I had to go find something. So I grabbed myself a little chopstick to help me get it through, but I found it quite difficult to get it started in some cases. So I will be looking for a straw I can pair with this, which is my usual technique for turning tiny things through. But you sort of can't find straws easily anymore, so we'll wait and see what happens with that. And now I'm just stuffing them, and it can be quite hard to get stuffing into small pieces, but it worked fairly well. And the good thing about working on tiny dolls is that it actually doesn't use very much materials. So this was quite enjoyable. I decided that I wanted these ears to have a little bit more of a shape. So I have folded the edges in ever so slightly and pinned. And now I'm just going to stitch them flat, because putting a doll together, especially when you're me and you don't have a lot of patience and you're not very particular, it can be very hard to get everything to stay how you want it to when you're sewing around the edge. So I decided to stitch them down to give me a better chance of them staying still. And now I'm just positioning all the pieces. And this is the part that I find the most difficult, is getting all of these pieces to stay where you put them and to make sure that your seam allowance stays good. You can always sew the arms on after the fact, and I'm just lazy and I don't want to. So I'd much rather fix a problem than hand stitch everything on by hand. So I'm just pinning them in, hoping for the best, and then I'm going to sew around it. So I have just missed a few spots there where the fabric underneath has slipped under and not been caught in the seam, so I'm just going to go back and stitch them again. This part is so exciting when you start to turn through the toys. I find this so exciting. I guess that's why I love to make dolls, is because it's a person, and this guy has turned out fairly crooked and wonky, but it doesn't take away from the fact that he's so very cute and I made him, and that's just a lovely, lovely feeling. So I'm just stuffing his body. For something this small, I would make it fairly firm, like not too tight because that will make him uncomfortable and stiff, but fairly firm just because it'll hold out his shape nicely. And then I just fold in the end and pin it ready for some legs. Now, despite my efforts, one of these arms has slipped out of the seam a little bit, and especially now that I've stuffed it, I'm not going to go back and undo the seam to get him back in there. What I'm going to do instead is just hand stitch this arm back in, just so that I don't have any raw edges showing and that it doesn't look funny or unfinished there. One of my favourite things to do when I'm making dolls is to make the legs out of a different fabric. That way they're wearing pants or leggings already. I think it makes it really cute, and I love the layering look of it with their extra clothes, but it also means that they don't have to have as many clothes, and they're not naked even when you take their clothes off, which I find a beneficial thing, because especially if you're making dolls for little kids to use, they always want to take all of their clothes off. It's just one of the rules. The legs are just that little bit wider than the arms were, which means they're so much easier to turn through. And I'll just do the same thing. I just stuff them. I always make sure to leave a little bit of the top unstuffed, just to make it easy to get it into the seam that you're stitching it into. Otherwise, it'll be too bulky and it will be hard to get it under the sewing machine. I have, and you can attach these limbs by hand. It can give you a neater finish, but I'm not really looking for that. I'm just looking for the dopamine hit of having made a cute little fox, and a small difference in the finish won't make me sad. Or it won't make me happier as well, so it's not worth it. But I just tuck these legs in, trying to make sure that he's not too wonky, that they're relatively even, and then I sew straight over the top. It's important that before you pin it, that you make sure it's aligned fairly well, just so it can catch both sides, but he's turned out pretty well this time. And I decided, I've done a little bit of experimenting, and I decided I wanted to knit a little dress for this fox. I feel like this yarn, which I dyed a while back, it's a little bit of leftovers, totally suited the colourings that I'd chosen for this. And I'm just measuring just to make sure that the skirt is long enough to cover enough, but also I want the legs to be sticking out to be able to enjoy that. Doing something like this, like if you're a knitter, it's pretty simple. I just guess how many stitches will be comfy around the neck. I did a little bit of 2x2 ribbing, and then I increased in every stitch and just have stitched it until it's a nice length and divided for sleeves. And now I am stitching around for the skirt. I'm just doing a couple of rows of garter stitch on the end just to discourage it from curling up. And then I will just cast off and sew the ends in. Sewing the ends in can be, I believe, the most difficult part of knitting. Many a time, a tiny bit of stitching up and end sewing in has delayed a knitting project quite significantly. But I managed to conquer that awful thing, and you'll be able to see in a moment I did sew the ends in and get it finished. It helps with this sort of thing that there isn't really a lot of finishing to do. There's just a few ends to sew in, which makes it quite easy to do. When I sew the ends in, I always try and just copy the pattern of the knitting. So with this end, I make sure to join that last round in, and then I just follow the knitting for a little while and trim it off. That way I feel like you're less likely to have the threads wiggle out, and it makes for a relatively neat finish. And now I will be working on a face. I'm just using Pearl 8 thread, which is my favourite. And I start off with a knot, and then I just gently pull the knot inside of the body, and that is how I like to start this sort of face embroidery. I'm just doing French knot on one side, and I've been struggling with pain in my hands at the moment, and I couldn't pull it through, so I just grabbed myself some pliers. It's also fairly stiff, but if you are struggling with this sort of thing where you're going through multiple seams and you're just having trouble, you can always use like a grippy thimble, like a leather thimble, that can help, but I couldn't find mine, so I'm just using these pliers to help me get just to get the thread through. And it was quite tricky, but this worked fairly well. She has turned out fairly wonky, but I feel like I quite enjoy that about her. I could have done a bit more planning to make her turn out a bit less wonky, but that's not really my thing. I'm a keep going sort of person, not a pause and plan it out too much. But I feel really happy with how she's turned out. I feel like I am raring to go with making a whole collection of these little people. And I may make a few different animals and a few different sizes just so it ends up a collection of family and friends, which I think would be really lovely. And I'm a bit scared, but I'm also going to work on making some furniture for her and somewhere for her to live. If this was fun, please subscribe for the next video.